Welcome. It's great to have you here again. Today, I wanted to have a conversation specifically around the question of, can yoga help us meet this moment? Can it really make a difference in the world that we're living in and living through? To answer that question, I'm going to present some ideas, but I'm going to invite you in to do more than just listen, but to actually do some reflection. In fact, this whole conversation is about the role of reflection, and in fact, maybe some things that we should consider as to be parts of the yoga tradition that are maybe were not emphasized so much in the earlier days, about the transplantation of yoga, this kind of bringing yoga into the Western mainstream as a Western mainstream practice and discipline. And so let's just begin right there. I mean, we can begin by just painting the landscape of what you and I are living in the midst of, which is division, pervasive anger, conflict, this polarization of our society. It's the MSNBC versus the Fox News, the red, the blue. And beyond that, it's like we're pervasively dealing with irregular sleep patterns, struggling with technology, mental illness, cancellation, anxiety, depression, and fear. I don't think any of those ideas are new. You've heard them. Many of us are living through them in real time. And yet we all know, both those who are practicing yoga and those who are not practicing yoga, that none of what I've just listed out is healthy or good for us. In fact, they're toxic. Certainly physiologically, they're toxic. They shorten our lives. They compromise our immune system. They lead to less a sense of autonomy, wholeness, oneness. And this is, interestingly enough, we know that this is not just the world out there, but in fact, people who practice a lot of yoga are subject to it. And that was really the genesis of this line of thinking that I embarked on about 6, 7, 8 years ago when I began to see the landscape changing. But back to the point of these things that, in a way, have become so normalized in society, and yet they are toxic, they are damaging, they are incredibly disruptive in terms of our well-being, physical, mental, cognitive. And we can certainly make the case that that these kinds of things like pervasive anger and fear and anxiety and depression and irregular sleep patterns are as pandemic as they are, as pervasive as they are, that indeed they may be affecting us spiritually. So the question I'm really wanting to ask and to ask us to consider and reflect a little bit upon is the notion of, is it possible to employ methodology within the yoga tradition, yogic techniques, that can be meaningful in helping us meet the moment? Well, theoretically, the answer, of course, would be yes. But in practical terms, is that real? Is that something we should expect? And if so, what do we need to know? Or what should we do? Or what should we employ more of to deal with these things that so many of us are going through, both internally and in our environment? Where do we go within our yogic toolbox, as it were? Are there things that we can emphasize? So let's kind of set the landscape furthermore. So just let's step back, 30,000-foot view of yoga. What are, using some modern parlance, what's the deliverables? What should we expect from yoga? At least the promise. Never mind, let's presume that for a moment we can step back and say, yes, it's an ancient practice. But here's what, at least from the ancient perspective, it should be providing us with. It's a short list. It's fundamentally 2 things as listed in the Yoga Sutra. So some of you that are familiar with the Yoga Sutra, it goes without saying, but for those of you who are not, this is in a way the definitive text of yoga that lays out in the most precise and most extraordinary way the landscape of yoga, like the destination, what prevents us from reaching the destination, both internal, external obstacles, primarily they're listed as internal obstacles, and the ways that we overcome those obstacles in order for us to get to the destination. So what I want to talk to initially is the destination. Two terms. In Sanskrit, apavarga, which more or less means liberation or freedom, and the other is bhoga, which has a lot of different meanings. Let's get to that in a moment. So, apavarga, freedom, liberation. So this really is describing the ultimate destination of what yoga practice is meant to provide for us. This is the treasure that awaits if we apply the methodology. Again, the jury or the verdict is, we haven't rendered a verdict yet whether these techniques of yoga are relevant now, whether they can even get us to this destination now. But let's just talk about the destination as an ideal point. So we've set course and we know where the course is supposed to take us, to freedom. So this is a freedom that is absolutely unconfined. By virtue of it being unconfined freedom, it is otherworldly. It's not something that has a polarity to it. In other words, there's day and night in our world. There are polarities, as good and bad. This is distinct from everything as it relates to material reality. It is unified awareness. There's either unified awareness or there isn't, but in the field of unity, there is no opposite. It is all-consuming. It is the pool of limitless grace, of self-luminosity, of wholeness, of oneness. So that's the destination. That's what yoga is pointing to. And ideally, if we use the methodologies, and again, I'm using the term ideally because we really haven't made the case that it's applicable now in the world that we live in, specifically the extent to which, even within the yoga world, the yoga culture, we've normalized anger. And we've normalized some of the things I described. There's plenty of people who are able to stand on their head, meditate, do breathing practices, vinyasa flow, whatever the yoga practice is, who are still inundated with some of the toxins I described earlier, the mental, emotional toxins, and even the spiritual kind of emptiness when the practices when they're not really meeting us, or when we're not meeting the practice. Okay, so we have this pool of luminosity, of grace, of wholeness, that tells us that this is the destination that, again, the yoga tradition is pointing to, that we can ultimately arrive at. Who doesn't want to believe that there isn't salvation somewhere in this world, that we can do practice that gets us there? That is the promise of yoga. But the other thing and this other term I introduce is the term is bhoga. Bhoga has a lot of meanings. I want to clear up some confusion about them. But what it suggests is that there is the opportunity. There isn't just a destination, but there's a kind of experience that is, I'm going to call it safe passage to that destination. That you and I do not just have the idealized expression of a destination, of an outcome, but that along the way there is some kind of salve, some kind of healing potential. And that's really what's described in bhoga. Bhoga is often taken out of context, or in a specific context, we'll say. It means things. It's actually, in some instances, referred to as kind of a lower ideal, a realm. So there's part of the meaning, or one of the meanings, or a few of the meanings, of bhoga would be enjoyment, delight, indulgence. So it does have this reference to sensorial awareness, sensorial experience, sensorial fulfillment. Even within that could be the idea of lust. But beyond that, it actually means advantage, prosperity, thriving, wellness. And so what this is then referencing, for lack of a better word, well, let's just call it thriving. That the yoga tradition, the yoga methodologies, moreover, allows us, equips us, develops a capacity and literally a strength to, while we're moving through the world, before we reach this kind of otherworldly destination, is to thrive. So let's just hold on to those two ideas and just make that the kind of the frame in which we now are going to view the landscape of yoga and practice, to help us determine whether or not, what's an appropriate expectation of yoga practice in this day, in this age, with technology, with society kind of feeling like in some ways it's going off the edge of the cliff. We're approaching the waterfall, and on the other side is just this crash and burn. We're going to land in less than an ideal way. What we could say, though, again, sticking with the old proposition, the ancient proposition, and a couple at least, the refinement of yoga by the, in the Yoga Sutra appears almost 2,000 years ago. And so this is a kind of encapsulation of all the knowledge that led up to that moment, that kind of collating and consolidating and organization of all of these teachings, these profound teachings that lead to this state, this otherworldly experience of being free, of ultimately experiencing the pool of grace of self-knowledge. So what we can say, again, according to this ancient model, is to the degree that we experience a level of freedom. So that means that you're not touched. It's like you're unafflicted by the comings and goings of the world. And while you're experiencing freedom, even while still in the world, there's an element of thriving within it. We can say that, at least according to ancient wisdom, the ancient view on this, is the extent to which you are experiencing freedom and a thriving, then indeed you are utilizing the methodologies appropriately. And I will offer then, conversely, the extent to which we don't feel free, we don't have a sense of ease, we carry burdens with us on a day-to-day basis. We don't get a significant, not just alleviation of the symptoms, but actually the delight of resting in self-essence, in luminosity, in wholeness. The extent to which that's not happening, our thriving or our freedom, it means that we either we're not practicing what needs to be engaged, needs to be employed in order for us to get there. Or, again, for the sake of the conversation, that there is no measure of practice that can help us navigate this world. And we should maybe stop trying, let go of our expectation that it can. That'll already help if I give up the expectation that yoga can work. So this conversation that I'm having today with you, as I said earlier, started about 6 to 8 years ago as a question that was rising out of what I was seeing as this kind of global societal cultural shift, not so much within the yoga world, but that was definitely infiltrating the yoga world, which is profound and deep unrest and conflict and division. And my biggest concern was that people who had the dedication and the discipline to practice yoga, meditation, pranayama, relaxation, yoga nidra, all of these profound practices that hold out these promises that I've already described, and yet these afflictions, these toxins, emotional and mental, physiological, even young people being affected by it. It's like no one was, or very few people, very few of us were, had the insulation, the armoring, the protection that more and more people who were deeply committed to these disciplines and contemplative practices and meditations, we're getting sucked into this normalization of anger, anxiety, fear, and depression. So now come to the point in the conversation to simply ask, well, is yoga just arcane? Is it just born of a time that was simpler and the not just technological advancements, but just the information age or whatnot, and was not present enough and wasn't enough of a factor that it made the promises so much more readily available. And I would argue, no, that's not the case. Yes, things are complicated. And in part, they're complicated because we're so unregulated. And by that, I mean self-regulated. Our behavior is at any given time moving toward adaptive or non-adaptive. Our thought patterns and the thrust and the kind of context of how we think and how we emote, it's either adaptive or maladaptive. And the fact that there was the Buddha and the Yoga Sutras and all of these methodologies, it's clear that human beings were not immune to suffering. We were not immune to conflict. We were not immune to grief, despair. That was happening not just hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago. I will say that it's complicated, or it's exacerbated by the fact of technology and our dysregulation and so much of the influence of technology. The fact, there's a statistic that Americans, for example, spend about 93 or 92% of their day indoors. We're completely disconnected from the cycles of moon and sun, which the circadian rhythm is one of the primary regulating factors that determines our hormones and shapes literally how our brain is functioning at any given time. So the fact that we become disconnected from nature, the extent to which we have, and our rhythms have gotten so thrown off, I would say only adds to the challenge that human beings have faced all along. But they've been here a long time. It's not new. It's simply not new. What I would say, and now I'm leaning right into one of the most important teachings that I think any yoga teacher worth their salt needs to, worth their weight, needs to understand and be able ultimately to address, not just understand it intellectually, but address it directly, which is that as our needs change, so must the practice. Our needs change as we age. Our needs change at various phases in our life. Our needs change as our circumstances change. And it's to that point that I think it kind of will move us to that understanding moves us to the next point in this conversation. What some of you know that I've taught, I've been a yoga educator, meditation teacher, yoga nidra teacher for 40 years. Yoga nidra about 30. And throughout that time, there have been let's call them inflection points. I can go to ones that predate 9/11, but I can remember 9/11 as being a definitive shift. Yoga until then, it was kind of a free-for-all, although it still is in many ways. But it was a free-for-all. And moreover, we just grabbed this exercise component of it, and how great was that? And, classes were starting to pack in and it became the new aerobics, but aerobics with kind of consciousness and really this happy meeting point of breathing in an organized way and folding and bending and getting more into our bodies and awakening some somatic awareness, at least at some level. But the answers that yoga needed to provide, or what it needed to provide at the time, pre-9/11, to me, changed on 9/11. That's when collectively, from around the globe, but particularly in the United States, and most particularly on the East Coast, right out of New York, I got this slew of emails in the days that followed from yoga teachers, some of whom I didn't know well, who were asking me for advice about what to teach in lieu of that day and the profound implications, the kind of deep impression it left on so many students of yoga. And suddenly now yoga wasn't just going to be random, or in a way, classes had to suddenly speak to that moment, that inflection point of 9/11. And I tried to give my best advice, but mainly saying, like, we need, in a sense, to honor the fact that people need to feel more supported, more grounded, more stabilized in the midst of destabilization, both in terms of public safety, in terms of a worldview that saw or believed America was invincible. They were deep. If you weren't around, or you weren't around or being aware of it at the time, there were profound implications that America never had to confront, and much of the Western world. And so that was an inflection point. And I'm only using that as an example to suggest that at that moment, something turned, and the yoga, or the methodology that was being practiced, needed to have a higher level of refinement. Without going through a history lesson or kind of all of these demarcations, but clearly one that most of us are still feeling the reverberations of was the pandemic. And now in the post-pandemic era, and clearly pre-pandemic, there was already powerful political shifts that were taking place, cultural shifts that were taking place. And that was a moment in time where we began to speak about being disenfranchised. Thank you. At least some portions of our society were, and brutality, police brutality and violence, and they were, depending on where you were putting your attention, this kind of tide was turning. Then there was the pandemic, or around that same time, which heightened seemingly the isolation, the conflict, the separation, the siloing of where we turned for our news and where our communities were, and the splintering of communities, the decimation of yoga classes, etc., as we knew them, the online atmosphere happening. And now we live in this kind of odd, it's not a pre-pandemic mentality at all. It's a post-pandemic kind of culture. And so again, the question becomes, as the challenges change, how should our practice change? The Rod Stryker podcast is in part sponsored by Sanctuary, my meditation, yoga nidra, and deep sleep app. With its easy-to-use interface and hundreds of audio tracks, upon downloading the app and becoming a subscriber, you will, within minutes, be able to find the ideal practice for whatever you need: healing, peace, empowerment, or a spiritual experience. You'll be able to find the right practice for you, no matter your level, and no matter how much time you might have. Also, I'm super pleased to be able to announce that we're now doing what I think is maybe the ultimate BOGO program. When you become a subscriber, you'll be able to give a subscription free to a teenager, a young person who could benefit from these practices. Just think about the difference you could make in a young person's life. We know that these practices do make a difference. My hope is that you will not just practice more, but give the gift of practice to someone you care about. How should our practice change? As we face more challenging times, in a way, if yoga is to address the time and move us in the direction of the freedom and the thriving it promises, we have to be more selective and more refined and more deliberate or purposeful in what we practice if it's going to meet the moment. Indeed, the path gets narrower. And what I'll say is that throughout my life, if practice was not meeting the moment, if it wasn't redirecting me back toward the experience of freedom, even in the midst of whatever's happening in my life or the circumstances of the world in general, then I'm not looking within the wisdom of yoga. I'm not looking to the right place, and I haven't adjusted my practice. Specifically. So the next point I want to offer is that practice does not necessarily make perfect. We could say the perfect practice makes perfect, but practice itself doesn't necessarily make perfect. Furthermore, I would say practice that's done either if you're self-guiding, doing self-guided practice, or you're being led through practice, whoever the leader of that practice is, if it's not done with a deeper understanding of the methodologies of yoga, and, I speak at length of this. This is kind of the basis of all the training content I've done throughout the decades. But what it's all about is really trying to flush out, to bring out, to unpack the knowledge of the ancient tradition, which combines Ayurveda and yoga and Tantra and Vedanta. So pranayama, all of these different elements of yoga. So without a deeper understanding of those various methodologies and the precision that's possible, how we can create more grounding versus more expansion, how we create more stability versus inspiration. There are all of these refinements, how you can conceivably improve someone's digestion or mental assimilation, if you will, versus how you can open their heart. These are the methodologies. And without that deep understanding, the practice is hit or miss, ineffectual. But let's keep going with this idea, because now here's the gist of this conversation. Practice without self-study, practice without self-reflection leads to a cycle of repetitive behavior. What the Buddha emphasized comes from the yoga tradition, samsara, the idea of cycling again and again and again and having to repeat the same lesson over and over again. So what really the point of this conversation is all about is the need for self-reflection. This is what this conversation is all about. So practice without self-reflection. You can go to 1,000 yoga classes. You can meditate. You can breathe. You can do a 10 or 15-minute headstand 7 days a week. All of these things are possible. They're all yogic methodologies. You can meditate on your chakras. You can do whatever you want in that regard, but without taking the time to understand the causes of your suffering beyond assigning the cause of that suffering to your circumstances. The extent to which we neglect to do that locks us into the pattern of repetitive behavior, repetitive thinking, repetitive emotions. And I will say hinders us, inhibits us from realizing the outcomes of yoga, those promises of freedom and thriving. Okay, so in a moment, I'm going to give you some backup. I'm going to give you some more specific descriptions of what self-reflection looks like, and I'm going to draw from the Yoga Sutra, one of the central teachings that, as I said, after some 6-8 years ago, asking these questions, seeing these toxins, if you will. And there's another way to think of these toxins, by the way, which I now want to introduce, is that they just are simply burdens to the mind. They are veils that darken the mind's perceptive capacities such that they hinder us, they inhibit us from experiencing yoga. So let's do this teaching now that comes, and I'm leaning into now, those of you who are familiar with the Yoga Sutra, I'm starting to drift now into the central teaching around overcoming despair. Despair is an intense word, man, right? Despair, sorrow. And that is in the Yoga Sutra. It's found, and for those of you interested, chapter 136. So this is this 36th verse within it, in the very first chapter. And in some ways, we could assert the very thing I learned, which is 136 is kind of in many ways, the apex teaching within the Yoga Sutras. Because what it suggests is that there is a field of awareness, there's a field or a experience that can be perceived that is beyond all sorrow and that removes sorrow. Okay, so that experience is this inherent essence that resides within us all. And if you like, for convenience sake, look, it's in some ways it's non-local, but for convenience sake, so that we can all have an orientation to it, this is the light of the soul, which, again, for a point of orientation, some teachings will say it's in the heart. So it's not intellectual. It is inherent. And it is an eternal illumination, an illumination of the heart that is inherently free. A light or an illumination or a transmission of the self or the self-essence that is beyond all sorrow, where no pain can enter. This is the eternal part of you. I've mentioned before in these podcasts, I'll mention again and again, because the fundamental premise of yoga is that there is this aspect that each of us have an eternal as well as a mortal dimension. So here's the thing, though. This eternal part of us remains hidden. This beautiful statement from the Upanishads that says it's hidden to all but a still mind. In other words, a mind that's not still cannot see it. Now, the other side of the coin is that the light of this light or this resource of the eternal is all-pervading. It is eternal. Therefore, it's not so much an issue of trying to somehow illuminate this self-essence as much as it is creating or preparing the mind to see it. So again, I want to restate that. The eternal part of each of us is a given. Why don't more of us know it? Because again and again and again in these teachings, the only thing that sets us free, remember freedom is one of the promises, the only thing that can set us free is glimpsing, is experiencing the eternal. As long as I'm identified with duality, my body, the world, night, day, right, wrong, left, right, red, blue, good and bad, there will be fear. There will be suffering. This is along really what the fundamental assertion of the Buddha. The only source of freedom is seeing that which is beyond change. The only way that we can live and understand ourselves from that is to understand or to enter into that pool of grace, of luminosity, which is always there. So what the tradition is going to teach us is that it's not a question of working on the heart. It's a question of turning our focus to the mind and whether or not the mind is prepared, capable of seeing it, of seeing that illumination that is inherently eternal. And therefore, it brings us to, in the Yoga Sutra's extraordinary elegance, I mentioned it's 136. It talks about this light in the heart. Well, 133, so just 3 verses before, it sets the stage for us being prepared to see it. And again, it's not going to focus on the heart. What it's going to do is focus on the mind. And in the 133, you see this, well, it doesn't seem all that profound. It doesn't seem like, okay, this, if you do this, it's the path to the sublime. It's the path to eternal freedom. It's the path to self-knowledge. But indeed, that is what it's setting up. So it doesn't seem so profound, but essentially it tells us that we have to transform 4 different qualities into more or less their opposite. Animosity into friendliness. The withholding of compassion into compassion. The tendency that we have toward diminishment of self or diminishment of others. And finally, judgment, which essentially is this thing that human beings do, which is to cleave the world into those we agree with and those we don't. And the ones that we agree with, invariably, we consider them to be virtuous, and the ones we don't agree with to be non-virtuous. So there's this simple, seemingly simple thing. Doesn't sound complicated, and it doesn't sound particularly profound, but it tells us that we have to find certain reconciliation in order to enter into the deep, into the profound and liberating experience of the self. The mind has to be prepared to actually enter into that knowingness. It can't. If we bring, in simple terms, our animosity, our lack of compassion, our pattern or ingrained habit of diminishment, and finally our judgment toward the light of the eternal, the light of the eternal can't actually imbue us with self-knowledge. So in one way or another, most yoga students understand that anger is not the friend of yoga, and that somehow or another anger, probably it's not great that I run around angry. I don't meet a lot of yoga teachers who would take great pride, or yoga, serious people involved in yoga who would really make the case and defend the idea that sustained anger is helpful to the path of yoga. I don't. However, subliminally, anger is present. And again, I want to make the case that it's kind of like there's been this profound, pervasive normalization of these various qualities I just described. Anger, yeah. Withholding compassion, yeah. Diminishment of others or self, yeah. And judgment, wow. And let's be honest, there's, again, plenty of people doing super disciplined, regular yoga, or maybe some who've given up because yoga didn't deliver on its promises for them. But this normalization of these things that from stepping back, we can identify as not being ideal. And then we see certain examples. We see it, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, seemingly resting in this space of non-judgment, of not withholding compassion, but active expression of compassion instead of diminishment. Great humility and a sense of communicating explicitly the fact that we all, in one way or another, belong to one another. So we don't see it. We don't, nowhere is anger idealized. And yet, it's like it's leaked in. And we become less self-critical, less self-aware in the yoga world, throughout the yoga world. Even those practicing in the most dedicated way, where we embrace these qualities, consciously or unconsciously. Again, they're toxic. Toxic in the sense that they disrupt our health, they disrupt the mind, and lastly, from the view of the tradition, what I would offer is they burden the mind such that it distorts our perception. So in part, I'm making the case, I realize this, I'm making the case that you cannot actually make significant spiritual progress and yet hold on to these four things that darken the mind. But I would say even forget the spiritual. So what happens if you're not that spiritual, that's not the primary driving force of your life? Is it okay to carry these things? And clearly there's things to be angry about and disappointed about and to judge. But if it's disruptive to health and sleep, yes, there's plenty of things to change and certainly many things to be concerned about. The question is, can you afford to carry them as burdens? And the answer would, I'm going to let you reflect on that answer. Over the course of 4 decades, I've trained thousands of students and mentored hundreds of teachers worldwide and shared content that, simply put, changes lives. I wanted to ensure that you can easily find the best resource you need to help you thrive. rodstryker.com is the easiest place to access video classes, immersions, courses, and trainings. Among other things, you'll find my class and course platform, Union, which features more than 150 and counting of my Tantra Yoga Alchemy classes on video, as well as all the audio tracks from Sanctuary. And for those looking to teach, dive deep in a retreat with me live, or to train, rodstryker.com is your home to begin and to continue your journey. So I want to now address how this is tapped into self-reflection and inquiry. What I said is the basis for disrupting, creating an opportunity to separate ourselves from the pattern of repetitive behavior. Samsara is this wheel of repetitive behavior, which is very much the basis for our suffering. So if we're going to disrupt that, we have to think about how we'll do that. So as I mentioned a few moments ago, I think most yoga students, most sincere people who are committed to the path of yoga know enough about it. Don't try their best not to go around expressing anger. And yet, again, we're all human beings, so we can't help but do it. So I want to say something that if we're going to do this and actually follow through on 133 as the practice is intended to be done, it has to be a practice not so much of simply putting icing on the half-baked cake, as it were, just simply glossing over our anger and going, well, I need to be nice, kind of smiling and yet inside carrying tremendous animosity. That is not what this practice in any way is speaking to. Instead, the practice in 133, in fact, as I said, is a deeply committed practice of inquiry, one in which acknowledges our part in these qualities that we, I think, can agree are less than beneficial: anger, the withholding of compassion, the diminishment of self and others, and finally judgment, the kind of cleaving into the world of those, cleaving the world such that those I agree with are virtuous, those I don't agree are non-virtuous. It's a practice of inquiry, not just of glossing over those feelings. And then, so as a result, the practice as it's described, and again, you have to look deeply into the commentary, but that's what I'm here to do today, and to share those teachings with you. So there's 3 stages in these practices. And I say this again because it's not just, well, I realize I'm angry and I better not express my anger. I don't want to be explicit with my anger. I don't want to show my anger. And particularly when I'm at a yoga potluck, and I'm being a little facetious, but when I'm around people who I hold common values with, I understand that being angry is not the best thing in the world. I think we understand that. So it's a 3-stage practice. And the first stage is we acknowledge we're angry. And I'm just using the first example because the first one listed, and they're done in an order specifically. The first one is animosity. Acknowledge animosity. That's the first step. The second step is to trace your animosity to its source. And that is not the world, not your circumstances. Here's the tricky part, friends. It's our stuff. It's not the world. The hint on this is the source of our animosity is not the world. It's what I put on the world. Again, leaning into the Buddha for a second. The world and the circumstances that surround us are inherently empty. We assign meaning to them. If you don't believe me or it doesn't ring true for you, just look around. Do you find there's any disagreement on the value or non-value of people, of environments, of what is helpful, what is not helpful, what is good, what is bad? Of course there is. And it's that disagreement or that disparity between what you perceive and someone who perceives it exactly the opposite way, it doesn't mean that you're a better perceiver. It just simply means that it's not so much the nature of the thing itself, it's the nature of the observer that's creating that reality. So part 2 is now to begin to trace it towards its source. And more specifically, that means, what is it in me that is the source of my anger? And the third, only after we've done that, and by the way, once we've done that inquiry in understanding the source of the anger, there's already a kind of transparency, a lightening of the negative emotion, the destructive emotion, in this case, anger, withholding of compassion, diminishment of self or others, and finally, judgment. In that inquiry, that recognition that it's less the world, less circumstances, less the people in it that burden my mind, that distort its clear capacity to perceive, when I make that inquiry, when I move inward and make that discovery about what my contribution is to, say, my anger, there's already a shift. And that leads to this final step, which is now the cultivation of the opposite attribute happens effortlessly. If not effortlessly, it's as though it comes within our reach and then we can breathe it in. In this day and age, it's important to understand that there are causes that disrupt our perception. And why is that important? One is to understand that our perception is subjective. Even that understanding alone is freeing. And not only does it free us from the suffering, from the kind of carrying of these burdens of these 4 qualities, but what it does is it makes us much more insightful. It also allows the mind to be more transparent and to see through the subjective veils that otherwise darken the mind and lead to this inaccurate understanding of ourselves and others and the world. It also primes the mind. This is most important as it relates to yoga practice, which ultimately is, again, accessing freedom, accessing your capacity to thrive in the midst of challenging circumstances. This is what sheds light. This is what sheds the light on, if you will, that sets it, that allows us to see this destination of profound freedom. I just want to give you a couple other things to reflect on in this. Because the Yoga Sutra, commentary on the Yoga Sutra, allows us to understand the source of each of these four qualities that need to be resolved in order for us to see absolutely clearly. The first is this idea of animosity. The source of your animosity is attachment. I'll let you reflect on it. And by the way, I've said it now several times. This teaching became so important to me personally. I felt like there was no more headstand to teach, no more handstand, no more pranayama, no more meditation. That if I didn't hit this thing about self-reflection and self-inquiry directly, if I didn't begin to address it directly and invite students into it, I realized that we were going to be as splintered and divided and conflicted and as fearful and as angry as any other siloed population or tribe within the world that we're living in. If we were going to rise above the fray and truly live out the promise of yoga, that these practices need to be done, these contemplations, these self-reflections. So it's why I've put all of them on my apps, the apps that I provide, Meditation Sanctuary app and the Union app, why they're so important for us to practice. So, attachment is the cause of your animosity. The primitive, most primitive desire to lord, to rule, to have rulership over that which you that either which you don't understand or that which may seem less than perfect. And by the way, it also relates to our desire to, our hesitancy, our resistance to acknowledging our own shadows, our own wound, if you will. And as long as that remains a factor in how we relate to ourselves, it will remain a constant in how we relate to the world. We won't find it easy to relate to other people's shadow, of which there, of course, will always be, unless we find resolution with our own shadow. So this withholding of compassion, both to ourselves and to others, has everything to do with not having yet made peace with our own wounds or shadows. And, you know, a word of inspiration maybe comes from Rumi, who says, the wound is where the light comes in. And by exercising greater compassion to ourselves and our own woundedness, and where we withhold love from ourselves, we become better capable of accepting the wounds in others. This is like the first step to accepting a shared humanity. I love this statement. I think it was Father Gregory Boyle who I heard say it. Rather than dwelling on how people carry themselves in the world, what if we instead of how others carry themselves in the world, what if instead we were aware of what people carry in the world? The source of our tendency to diminish ourselves and others. It's again just born from our own tendency to kind of shrink our sense of autonomy, to feel smaller than we actually are. Fundamentally, it's an expression of really not having a full version of yourself. And the opposite side of the coin as well is to inflate our sense of self by diminishing others. And lastly, it's our judgment of wanting naturally, and this is they're all natural inclinations. They're just very primitive. They don't contribute to the evolution of the self nor of society, which is that we want to please people that we agree with. And we want to find agreement. We define ourselves as much by who we chose choose to be with and who we choose to gather around and support. We define ourselves as much by that, by as much as who we agree to push out. This is part of that in-group, out-group dynamic that, again, is now so alive in our society, and yet we're neurologically wired to do it. So in that tendency that we have to find our in-group, we automatically push people out, and we push them into that, essentially that pile of, what we call the descriptor is fundamentally in the Yoga Sutra, they're non-virtuous. They're not good. They're not good. So again, it's not the people in the world that are creating the burdens that lead to the suffering, that lead to the distortion of your perception, that make it more difficult to connect to the internal, to the eternal version of you, that then make it more likely that your yoga won't deliver on its promises. It's not the world. Yes, the world is a mess, but it's what we bring to it. And understanding what we bring to it, this is the real work. This is what frees us from repetitive behavior. In the words of, kind of taking from the theme of Richard Rohr, Franciscan priest who's written extensively on kind of recreating ourselves in a better, more aware way. He used the title of this book of Falling Upward. It's really through our mistakes, but then understanding them through the light of inquiry that allows us to cease the pattern of repeating the same mistake. The bottom line is, my summation of this conversation is all about self-inquiry has to become part of yoga. For it to have meaning, for yoga to deliver on its promise in this age, yes, please meditate. Yes, please regulate your breath. Yes, do the things that bring you back to a state of calm, that help you unwind, that help you re-envision and re-experience your natural state of well-being, that build your homeostatic response, that help you sleep better. Do those things that will do that for you. But it is more critical than ever that we bring the spirit of this tiny little teaching, 133, and the supportive mentions of it throughout the yoga tradition, which is self-study, sadhyaya, self-reflection, as conveyed in Sutra 133, that you bring that to your yoga. Think about these 4, maybe even do one of these practices or all 4 of these practices, and take your time. You cannot possibly find deep reconciliation, self-awareness, and freedom having done them once. I wish in the end to just simply say the normalization of anger and these other qualities I've described is not conducive to yoga. And they will make the destinations and the promises of yoga more distant, seemingly less accessible, and perhaps even lead to a certain level of disillusionment as to whether yoga can deliver on its promises in this day and age. I'm quite certain that if we are mindful in this way, that we bring self-reflection, that we take responsibility for our experiences, that we can profoundly change and we can contribute in a way rooted in peace, rooted in self-understanding, rooted in friendliness. I'm now going to use the terms one more time: friendliness and true compassion, the active expression of love, not just resisting violence, but the true expression of love and caring. That we can find joy in those we would otherwise maybe diminish or elevate and diminish ourselves. And we can find a shared joy, a shared humanity. And finally, that we can find acceptance in the face of judgment. That not only can we individually find more peace, but through that intrapersonal, that relationship to ourselves, we will create a different resonance. We'll ripple, that kind of reconciliation will ripple outward. We'll treat others differently. And we will return to a sense of the viability of our practice as being a resource of true meaning and great value. Thanks for listening. Until next time, keep practicing and keep evolving.